Fiction is rad. It tells cool stories and fills us with weird and colorful emotions. If you agree, maybe you want to know more about it. Maybe you're interested. Maybe you'd even enlist in a literature or textual analysis course at your local smart people factory. However, if you did, you'd quickly realize that something is off. Instead of talking about characters, plot twists, and stories, you'd likely be asked to analyze the structure of a text, the lines of a poem, the form of the fiction. That is quite boring, isn't it? We should be discussing character arcs, not comma placements. Frustrated, you might raise your hand and ask, hey, why are we studying form instead of content? If this artificially constructed scenario were to play out like this, your artificially constructed teacher would almost definitely reply with something like this. We study form instead of content because form is content. But what does that mean? Let's ask the scary question. What is a story? Well, to grossly oversimplify, we could say that any story is a collection of events which include and affect characters, tied up neatly by themes and messages. Okay, second question. Where does this story live? Can our fiction just exist by itself? No. No, it can't. Fiction always has to exist in some medium, in some form. A story only comes into existence through the act of being told through a specific vehicle. Whether it's being told to a reader or to the author by the author themselves does not matter. Be it on the page or in the depths of the author's mind, a story is always constrained to a certain form, a certain landscape of appearance, expression, and shape which gives it permanence in our world. So, the existence of any story, of any content, is inherently linked to its form. And because that form is used to create the content in the first place, these two aspects merge into one and the same entity, which means that to study form is to study content. To illustrate, let's look at a few examples. This channel is anime manga focused, so why not start there? Manga as a medium has a pretty clear form. Pages filled with panels that show imagery and speech bubbles that present text. A simple and effective blend of written and visual storytelling, the archetypical visual novel. But this form can be modified and twisted in order to support and create the content of a story. Take the speech bubble, for example. On the surface, these are as straightforward as you get. Circles that convey information by just writing it out. But they can still be tampered with. In Tatsuki Fujimoto's Chainsaw Man, the main character Denji meets a mysterious and alluring young woman named Riz, who seems to be hiding something. When confronted by an enemy, she seemingly drops the act and reveals her true self. But the text she speaks suddenly changes from whatever language you're reading it in into Cyrillic Russian. So the very element of the manga that's purely dedicated to conveying written information suddenly denies us that. But it goes further. Fujimoto could have just said, and then she spoke Russian. But instead, he has Riz speak regularly for almost 3 pages, with the bubbles still arranged the way we are used to, just now in Russian. Now, there is doubt. We were reading a manga in our probably not Russian language, and now the text has changed, but the presentation is still the same, as if we're supposed to still understand what she is saying. Did our manga reader mess up? Is it a printing error? Are we seeing right? By subverting something as basic as the language the story is in, Fujimoto enhances the mystery around Riz and sows the seeds of uncertainty. At the same time though, he paradoxically gives us information, since we now know that Riz has some connection to Russia, which itself springs connotations and associations in our brains regarding history and geopolitics. So, the most marginal distortion of a formal parameter has drastic rippling effects on the creation and presentation of the content, bringing the two extremely close together. For a different, much milder example, we can turn to Tomura Shigaraki, My Hero Academia's big antagonist. Throughout the manga, he is depicted as a childish fool who has to grow into his role as the main villain. In tandem with this journey, his speech bubbles start off being shaky, wavy, and uncertain. This simple alteration of the bubble shape creates an auditory proxy in our minds. While the manga is obviously a silent work, this non-standard shape creates the illusion of a non-standard sound within our inner ears. A slurred speech, a stutter, a mumble perhaps, signs of insecurity and a lack of charisma. So when the bubbles then become increasingly smoother and rounder as Shigaraki evolves into a more charismatic and confident leader, that evolution is carried into his speech. This is not a huge element by any means, but for what it is worth, it's fascinating that a silent medium can simulate the evolution of the character's voice and speech pattern through this. Again, the form is intimately interlinked with the content presented to the reader, as a facet of the content is only brought into existence by the distortion of the form. But the speech bubble is only one element. There is also, of course, the paneling. This is an aspect that gets discussed more often than the bubbles, and for good reason. The paneling of a manga, the way the image boxes are shaped and arranged, is one of the more obvious and easily perceived parameters of the medium. While you have certainly heard other and bigger creators than me talk about how paneling can be used to naturally guide the reader's eye as one pleases, a second formal capability of it is to create symbolic and thematic relationships between the characters and the spaces they occupy. If we stay with Shigaraki for just a bit longer, once he becomes the leader he's meant to be and turns into the most powerful entity in the story, the paneling of the scenes that include him changes. Suddenly, he begins popping out of the pages more than any other character, existing outside of the regular panels and inhabiting a weird meta space. This is a formal element that denotes his new status as a transcendental being. Additionally, his body is now quite often used to separate panels, his arms and hands and fingers being the borders between them. Through this, Shigaraki's overwhelming power is translated into the real world, as he now possesses so much strength that he bends the very pages that confine him to his will. The manga plays by his rules, the images are separated by his command. So by using the form of the story, its content can pass through the fourth wall and affect our own reality, namely the way we perceive the manga visually. But paneling isn't always this drastic. Sometimes a single page can utilize one trick to enhance or communicate one specific concept relevant to that one moment. In Naruto, the titular hero is faced with an abominable opponent in the fierce Gaara, whom he fights in a brutal deathmatch. However, as they clash, it becomes increasingly clear that their lives were incredibly similar, from social isolation to being burdened with a demon living inside of them. It was in fact only the most minute kindness and human connections that prevented Naruto from turning into a bloodthirsty psychotic beast like Gaara. As the battle rages, trees fall, and a giant toad drops a giant sword, don't ask, the combatants tire and exchange glares, resulting in this page. At first, the visual metaphor seems clear. The other face is reflected in the blade in both panels. They are opposites and yet the same. But this is brought even further once you look at the paneling. The white separating line between the panels is visually identical to the middle ridge the stereotypical image of a sword would have, therefore creating the impression that we are looking at one image with a double-edged sword in the middle. while this isn't how the frog sword actually looks, the imagery is nonetheless clear. It reinforces the idea of them being two sides of the same coin, opposites sprung from the same origin, altered by the tiniest of differences. So again, the form of the medium creates imagery and thus creates content. Let's take a more combinatorial look. We have now seen examples of panels and bubbles being used to form content, but what about using both at the same time? Meet Jujutsu Kaisen, Weekly Shonen Jump's current mega hit and a personal recommendation of this channel. At one point in the story, the space-manipulating sorcerer Gojo faces off with the superhuman Toji. As they do battle, Gojo prepares to launch his finishing attack, Hollow Technique Purple. As he yells out the name of his technique, we get this page. Seems like a normal spread at first, but once we turn the page further, we see that Toji got indeed hit by purple, which tore apart the space and matter around his left shoulder. If we now go back to the page before, we can now notice that the circular speech bubble that contained the name was actually a stand-in for the attack itself. Essentially its own panel, which served as a visual representation of purple's impact. So, a speech bubble is made into a visual panel, which through its overlap with a character indicates that character being hit by a diegetic attack. In a meta way, Gojo's attack materializes only through us reading the speech bubble that encodes its shape. This is a formal trick that takes complete advantage of the unique properties of a graphic novel like a manga to quite literally create the content of the story through its form and through its relationship with the reader and the real world. As you can now see, form and content keep having these intimate interactions. We only really looked at a very small slice, but the form of any work can be manipulated in numerous ways, which all then go on to influence the content. But perhaps even more importantly is the realization of exclusivity. All the examples we have listed can only work in the exact medium they appear in to denote the exact content they are linked in. The form and the content are in fact so interlinked that they cannot exist without one another, at least not without drastically changing themselves. And that's good. Fiction and art in general will always be reliant on the medium it inhabits, as it literally could not take any shape without a vehicle to carry it. So a good artist will always find ways to take advantage of the unique properties of the medium to elevate their work. In a way, the closer and more unseverable the connection between form and content becomes within a work, the more impressive and elegant it ends up being, as it coalesces into something that could only ever exist in that precise combination. So, if you do end up taking that literature class, which I highly recommend, do stay patient. Yes, counting poem lines and looking up vocabulary is pretty boring at face value. But as you gain a deeper understanding of any medium, be it prose books, poetry, visual novels, or TV, you become more cognizant of how it is utilized to tell stories, and thus you approach an understanding of the content. Because, as you now know, form is content.